Now, I'm thrilled to have Drew Holden make his Sky News debut tonight. He is a very impressive DC-based reporter who can explain without bias or hysteria why so many Americans don't believe the electoral process is free and fair, and what role big tech and the media played in influencing the 2020 election result. I spoke to Drew earlier. Drew, wonderful to speak with you. Let's start with what's been called the crisis in democracy in America, where we've got a large portion of the population that does not have faith in the electoral process. And much of that has to do with the way the media and the all-powerful big tech covered Trump and his opponents over the last 4 years. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right, Rita. You know, I think that right from the jump with President Trump, even before his inauguration, we saw a lot of coverage that, in retrospect, looks pretty bad, right? We had the Russian collusion allegations. We had a whole bunch of things that kind of went bunk here in the last 4 years. And as we've had the run-up into the presidential election, we saw a lot of faith that had been undermined over the course of 4 years, and certainly going back years and decades even before that. But then there's also been concerns about the amount of information that the American people have had, both about President Trump, but more importantly about President-elect Biden.
Well, absolutely. We saw throughout the election campaign, the big media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, Washington Post, New York Times, so many others, pretty much ignore the Biden family's dealings with China and Ukraine, or worse, pretend that those stories were some sort of a Russian disinformation campaign. And even after the New York Post acquired Hunter Biden's laptop or the contents of it and had those series of bombshell stories, there was no reporting, just discrediting of the New York Post story. You're in the media.
That's right.
You report on the media. Can you wrap your mind around what happened there and how this story was ignored and discredited?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think discredited is the right word. We saw a pretty active campaign across the board where you had media outlets, one after the other, line up and say, you know what, not only were we not going to talk about this story, we're going to very deliberately tell you to not listen about this story. And so I think some of that has to do with, you know, there were a lot of outlets that got burned pretty bad. They got burned with heading into 2016 with the coverage about Hillary Clinton's emails that turned out not necessarily to be as big or as interesting as maybe we thought they were then. But then, you know, I think they also got burned in the other direction. They talked about Russian collusion over and over again, and they realized that a lot of what they had been fed just wasn't true. It wasn't accurate. And so they get this big allegation that comes out shortly before, and they really actively work to smother it. You know, I think one of the most interesting ones I think about, and this is only weeks ago, right, is NPR actually put out an editor's note essentially where they said that we don't want to talk about something because it's not a story, and it's so much of a non-story that we don't want to waste our readers' time and we don't want to waste our listeners' time. And weeks later, right, obviously we have an election, a lot of which had to do with the two individual candidates' allegations of corruptions, their personalities, their family dealings, things like that. They have to come out and say, oh, and by the way, those Biden emails that we told you not to look at or listen to wasn't worth your time. They're worth your time now, as it were.
Yeah. Well, yeah, now we're hearing about money laundering allegations, foreign ties, all sorts of investigations that have been ongoing since 2018. But do you think it was just because the media was burnt so often with their false stories about Trump? Or was it that they saw this as a genuine threat that this could propel Trump to a second term if these stories about the Biden family, particularly the dealings with China, were going to be damaging and change how people voted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, right? I think a lot of it has to do with well-intentioned concern that they were going to take something that they weren't sure was a story and make it into a story. But at the end of the day, one of the things that, you know, I always come back to, I know a lot of other people come back to, is somewhere between 80, 85, 90% of the American media identifies as left-wing. That's going to give them particular blind spots. It's going to cause them, even with the best of intentions, it's going to force them to see things in a way that aren't necessarily accurate. And it's going to lead most of them to see things in a way that's wrong in the same way, in the same direction. So, yeah, I'm sure none of them wanted to be in a boat or in a position where they had to be the person to say, oh, yeah, that guy, maybe he threw the election to Trump.
Now, how do you see big tech's interference, if any, in the 2020 election? I'm talking about Twitter, Facebook, and to a certain extent also Google and YouTube.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the first things that happened with the New York Post story was very, very quickly Facebook and Twitter prevented its spread. On Twitter, you couldn't share it as a direct message. You couldn't post the link for a long time. The Post's account was locked, right? It very, very quickly prevented anyone from even getting to read or hear about these stories and allegations. And it was interesting because it created this really, really quick and succinct feedback loop with the Biden campaign. The Biden campaign said, we don't believe the story. Facebook and Twitter said, well, we're not going to allow people to spread this because it could be disinformation or misinformation or whatever the word of the day is. And then the Biden campaign and the rest of the Democrats said, hey, look, there's Facebook and Twitter. They're saying this isn't a story. Why would anyone be interested in running with it? And then the loop continues, it continues. And I think that, unfortunately, right now we don't really have a good enough grasp of the sorts of impacts that can have on beliefs, on voting patterns. But it's I think, really easy for me to believe it, and I'm sure you too, that there's a lot of people who simply didn't get enough facts about one of the candidates in this race and their families and potential corruption. And a lot of the blame for that rests with the social media companies.
Oh, yeah, we can agree on that one. Now, we saw the hatred of Trump pretty much evident throughout the media's reporting on the COVID crisis. Very different reporting to what we saw with, say, New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo, who totally mishandled his state's response, one of the very worst death rates in the world. In fact, I think only New Jersey's worse. But he got an Emmy. He published a book on leadership through the pandemic. This week, he's been accused by a former staffer of sexual harassment. Now, again, I want to just get an idea, Drew, of how the media, Time's Up, Me Too movement, how they have reacted to this. Have they backed up the victim and called for Cuomo to stand down, or what's been the reaction?
Well, I mean, Rita, the answer has been they haven't really talked about it at all. There's been a little bit of coverage from a handful of outlets across mainstream and liberal media. But a lot of those have to do with couching those allegations within the context of, well, Andrew Cuomo denies them. His office has put out a statement saying that they're not true. We don't have any way to verify whether these claims are legitimate or true, right? And these are the same media, mind you, who, when we look back at something like the Kavanaugh appointment, you had people who were rushing head over heel to dig up 30-year-old, 35-year-old allegations and yearbooks and things like that, and take those as the God's honest truth about these individual allegations, and now they're not even given the light of day.
No, and with Kavanaugh, there was never even any proof that he was in the same room or had even met some of his accusers. In fact, I think perhaps all his accusers. But here, you would think the allegations are far more credible and very little in the way of a response. Now, I'm interested, as you are a very sharp analyst when it comes to viewing the media. How do you think we're going to see the next 4 years of the Biden administration reported? We've already had a fake outrage this week with the future First Lady, Jill Biden's doctor qualification not being sufficiently respected. That caused a huge furor. And just didn't see that with Melania. You saw her be absolutely torn to pieces. But if you call Jill Biden anything other than doctor, you are guilty of misogyny.
Right. You've offended not only her, but the entire female race. It's fascinating. I think that, unfortunately, one of the things that we're going to see over the next 4 years is we'll see just as much focus as we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years on Donald Trump. Right. He's someone who will obviously continue to demand a lot of attention. He will continue to be in the spotlight. And I think that there are still a lot of reporters who have made their beat, they've made their name, they've made their reputation on attacking and investigating and asking questions against one guy and one political party. And I think that they're not going to be willing to pass that up, right? And so I think you're going to see, unfortunately, as a result of that, a lot of people who should be investing their time looking at the ways Biden is responding to or failing to respond to different challenges that greet the American people. A lot of potential corruption that involves him, that involves his family, that involves not just accusations, but investigations over the course of years. You're going to see all of that energy and that interest that was directed and in many cases misdirected against Donald Trump and his family. And you're going to see it, rather than go to the man who is going to be the next president of the United States, it'll continue to go to someone who is no longer going to hold a public office. I think what you're going to end up seeing is there's not going to be much interest and appetite in going after someone who most of the American media and, plenty of people within the American public just think is a good guy. That's not as interesting. That's not as storyable for a lot of these reporters, unfortunately.
Well, that will be fascinating to have more scrutiny of the man who's left office and the one who's actually the leader of the free world. But if Trump's going to have all this attention from the media as a private citizen, what will he do next? Do you think he will run again? And if he doesn't, who are the leading Republicans with a realistic chance in 2024? Trump has changed the GOP, I would say, perhaps forever. Do you think he'll run again?
Yeah, Rita, I do. I think that assuming that nothing else changes really radically, right? I could see him going on and leaving public office and having a gig that he very much enjoys, either in radio or TV or something like that. And so who knows? Maybe he likes that so much he doesn't want to run for office again. But yeah, I think he probably does. I think at the end of the day, there are going to be a lot of Republicans who will push him to run again. There are a lot of people, I live in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of people in this town who don't like Donald Trump. The reality is he is the most popular person in the Republican Party, and there's nobody close. And so there's going to be a lot of people pushing for him to run. I think he would clear the field as a nominee if he went into it. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing a lot of people who are these kind of maybe 2024 candidates not even throwing their hats into the ring is because they expect that he will.
That would be fascinating, because if he announces it, say, in the next few months, that will overshadow the Biden administration, whatever the media do. Absolutely. Yeah, that will be fascinating.
Yeah. And Rita, I think part of it, too, is a lot of it will depend in terms of his potential to run again, his interest in running again. I think a lot of it will depend on what happens with the Biden administration. If it's clear sailing, not a ton of scandals, relatively normal presidency, he's got a 60% or so approval rating, the Republicans don't like him, but he's getting some things done in Congress, things like that, maybe he doesn't run. But I think there's a really legitimate chance that 2 years from now, as we're heading into the midterms, we're talking about the overlooked scandal that was the Biden family corruption allegations. And we're starting to peel back some of these things that happened to Trump. And when he was, obviously very upset about things like the Russian collusion investigation. What happens if we find out that a lot of the people involved in that are facing criminal charges here in a couple of years? I think a lot of those things that Trump takes as personal wounds, and I think he's got every reason to, could potentially also propel him to want to run again.
Oh, my goodness. We're going to have some fun over the next few years. Drew Holden, thank you so much for your time.
Rita, the pleasure's mine. Fun is certainly one way to put it.